Who's heard about Apple versus Samsung? I have a Droid that's made by Samsung. I also have my first iPhone. I've got an iPad. I like all this stuff. Now, one of the things that you've heard and read about this litigation is how can someone get a design patent on a smartphone with rounded corners? Have you heard that? It's a fair question. It's actually an oversimplification. It makes better news, but what is shown in this figure 3, that shading indicates that there's glass there. So one of the things that's common with patents is when you become familiar with a product, you begin to have this mindset, well, of course, how else would you do it? But the reality is nobody had a smartphone before that had glass all the way up to the edges. So you have not only the rounded corners, but you have the glass. And the purpose of a design patent is to cover the appearance, the ornamental appearance, not the functionality of it, not the structure of it. Apple has a lot of patents. They've been very successful. This is one that nobody noticed. You can learn a lot by watching patents as they come out. This is the tablet. And in 2005, everybody was ho-hum, what's the big deal? That was before the tablets really came on the market. Now, of course, that's intensely competitive. Inventors. Steve Jobs, world famous, a very creative guy, came up with a lot of ideas. He's named on hundreds of patents. I just read his biography, absolutely fascinating. There was a lot that was not likable about Jobs, but there was a lot that was admirable about him also. And, of course, the other person who's always mentioned in the same breath is Wozniak. It took both of them. So Jobs was a very creative guy. He came up with ideas. He said, this thing's got to be light. It's got to have a long battery life. It's got to have glass that will stand up to impact. It's got to be done in an impossibly short time. But who are the people that actually implemented those things? Those were people who were better engineers than Jobs was. And one of those, of course, was Wozniak, particularly in the early days. Now, I talked about Apple versus Samsung. There's also Samsung versus Apple. These are global, far-flung brawls in patent litigation. And there's a lot of thought that goes into where the litigation should be brought. Maybe it's in the U.S. Samsung chose to sue Apple in Korea, and Samsung also has counterclaims against Apple. They both have huge numbers of patents. So Samsung has won patent litigation against Apple in Korea. I was just in Korea last month at an international congress. And the news in Korea is, I was reading this in the newspapers, it's all about the U.S. patent litigation. They had detailed articles about the judge, Ms. Koh, K-O-H, and how difficult it is for her to handle this case. So patent litigation and stockpiling of patents are increasingly global. In the medical field, people sometimes choose to litigate their patents in Europe because they can get faster results. And they can get those products on the market faster. It takes a longer time to get a pharmaceutical on the market in the U.S. because of the FDA approval, which is a very stringent process. IP assets. It's widely reported that most assets of most corporations are intellectual property. I wonder a little bit about these numbers. The tangible assets are the book value, that's the brick and mortar. What else makes up the value of the company? It's intellectual property. It's not always patents. Actually, most of the intellectual property, most of the value is actually in the trade secrets. It's in the confidential information. It's in the know-how. It's the stuff that is in people like you. It's in your heads. That's where the intellectual property is. It's knowing how to use the technology, how to make the process work, how to make the iPad work. That's intellectual property just as well as patents. Trends in globalization. Even U.S. patents are global. Here's the top 10 companies for getting patents in the United States last year. For the 19th straight year, IBM is at the top of the list with 6,000 patents. Now, arguably, maybe actually, they're not as dominant in their technical field as they once were, but they're still cranking out a lot of patents. But look who's second: Samsung of Korea, Canon of Japan in third, Panasonic of Japan in fourth, Toshiba of Japan in fifth. You have to get down to Microsoft in sixth place to find another U.S. company. And that's the last U.S. company that you see on the list. So only 2 out of the top 10 companies for getting U.S. patents are American companies. That's how high the stakes are, and that's how active the technology development and the patent filings are from other countries. And when I go to other countries and I talk to patent attorneys from those countries, they tell me that while the first country of choice for most of them is going to be their own country, the next country, if they're going to seek international rights, is always the U.S. Why? Because the market is so big here. Here's some trends. In 1995, I was out at Micron in Boise. They had 63 issued patents. They were paying a lot of money in royalties. They said, we got to get some patents. And they really ramped up the filings. They issued 1,800 patents in 2002. What's that, about 30 times as many as they did just 7 years before that. But in 2011, they were down to about half that. So they reached a peak, and then they kind of plateaued. Why? Probably because they decided some of those patents they were filing on really weren't all that valuable. Now, you know, everybody thinks, let's get this really great patent, but what it's really about is the great engineering. It's really about the great technology. It's really about great products. And you see time and time again companies that have a lot of patents, but if they don't have the right technology, if they don't have the right innovations, if they don't have the products, then those patents might not be all that useful or all that valuable. HP made a big public statement about how they were going to file 3,000 patent applications a year. And they did. But look what happened to their filings. After 2003, they went down almost every year to 2011. So here's a company that has been a great company, a great innovator, but their innovation slacked off. And their patent filings slacked off also. So what does that tell us? Patent stockpiling, that's what I call it. Let's just get a lot of patents. It's no cure for failure to innovate successful new products and technologies.